Mission control to Apollo 1. This Jeep is the opposite of the Jeep we drove yesterday. It's an irony. This Jeep is on 1-ton Dana 80 front and rear, 40-inch tires. It's heavy, winch, bumpers, you name it. This Jeep has basically the same engine in it that the Jeep we drove yesterday had. That is a 5.3 Gen 4 LS. This does have an LC9, which is an aluminum version of the LMG we drove yesterday. And I must say, I did a pretty good job hauling this Jeep up the hill. It's somewhat of a crappy day out there. Rainy, windy, cold. But got to make my test drives, and I actually enjoy this weather. We've got snow just up ahead of us. That's about 4,000 or 5,000 feet elevation. So the irony of this build versus the Jeep we drove yesterday is they're running basically the same engine, but this Jeep has a single axle that costs almost as much as the entire engine swap in the Jeep we drove yesterday. I don't feel either Jeep is better than the other. They each have their purpose. The Jeep we drove yesterday will serve its purpose well, and this one will serve a different purpose. I will say with these 40s, this Jeep does ride a lot better on this collegiate trail. So this Jeep is going to have the same advantages that the Jeep had yesterday with this 5.3. Regular gas, conventional oil. Actually, it's doing pretty good on the economy. I drove from basically northeast Vegas, where Nellis is, all the way south to almost Pahrump on less than a quarter of a tank. This Jeep also has a story. This Jeep was started by a customer in Texas 3 years ago, and he decided to do the engine conversion, hydraulics, suspension, brakes, and it became a big project, and he's a busy guy, so he brought it by the shop for us to complete it. And I gotta say, my guys did a pretty good job. In about 1 week, we got the suspension, steering, brakes, engine performance all buttoned up, and now I'm out here on the trail. Still has a little ways to go. Got to do some bumpers and fender clearancing, but we're out here on the trail with it. And if this Jeep stays on the trail or the streets, this 5.3 is more than enough. It runs great. So it just goes to show you the different ends of the spectrum on these engine conversions. We have Jeeps that have no mods at all running our conversion, and then highly modded Jeeps like this one. Now, this specific Jeep had 3-year-old MoTech electronics with a Gen II module. And he said, I want all the upgrades. And I told him the truth. Our Gen 2 electronics were great. They were very reliable, fully functional. So we chose to stay with the Gen 3 electronics. And the only upgrade we made was we swapped out the crank trigger wheel for an RPM board, because this customer is going to do some mudding and running through streams and creeks, and you want to have I think it's more reliable to have the RPM board inside the cab than it is the trigger wheel on the balancer, although the trigger wheel still works well. I've got a lot of guys still running those from 6-7 years ago. But that's literally the only upgrade we made. This Jeep is running the JK accessory drive, and it's running our earlier steel accessory drive, which works fine. There's no reason to upgrade it. Now, this customer, being a higher end build, may want our billet brackets at some point, but the reality is these brackets are doing an excellent job. Air conditioning, cruise control, tap shift. We're running a 241J transfer case. I'm really not sure what all these switches are for. We got a cage inside, winch, bumpers, lights. Nice Jeep. With this 5.3, he can run regular gas, get reasonable economy off-road, and it will run for hundreds of thousands of miles. I think the Jeep I'm driving in is somewhat of an example of the evolution of our product. If you look at a Porsche or a Mercedes, let's say, essentially they keep the same models for many years and improve on them. They evolve them. And if you look at the roots of our current kit, you can find it in this kit. Basically, this was a hand-built harness with full power distribution and full ground distribution, just like the Jeep that we saw yesterday. So if you look at this kit from 3-4 years ago, it's very similar to what we're doing now. The accessory drive is steel instead of aluminum, but it works just fine. The harness is very reliable. This does have the Busman fuse box with full power distribution, and this has the beefed up grounds with full ground distribution. We were running essentially the same intake, the same air filter assembly. We really can't make it much better. It's evolved to a point where it's rationalized. So while you can make it cheaper, you can try to lower the cost by cutting corners, removing circuits out of the harness, or making parts cheaper. For example, the coolant bottles we use, they're stainless steel. They're not aluminum. They're not plastic. We used aluminum for a while, but found that they would oxidize, and then it would be hard to get the cap off, and they would look ugly. Even when they were anodized, even when they were coated, we found that. So we ended up using polished stainless steel, and we found that held up very well over the years. So we continue to use a stainless steel bottle, even though the cost is a little bit higher. We use all Delco components in our kit. MAF sensor, for example, fuel tank pressure sensor. Sometimes you can get a good substitute or replacement in the aftermarket, and we've done that. But on critical sensors like the MAF sensor, we've tried aftermarket sensors, and the reality is they don't work. They will work to a certain degree, but they will not give you that OE level of performance. And the MAF sensor is an extremely sensitive sensor, and we stay with the Delco. And if you look at this kit from 3 or 4 years ago, or you look at the current kit, we're running the same Delco MAF sensor. That doesn't mean that the Gen 4 5.3 is not a viable engine. It's an excellent engine. I really like this engine. It just has limited applications. So you choose it if it fits your application. If it doesn't fit your application, like you live in Colorado, you live up in Lake Tahoe, you have a really heavy Jeep that you do a lot of highway travel with, don't pick the Gen 4 5.3. But if you're going to do what I'm doing right now, which is basically crawl, do expedition, I've put 5.3 Gen 4 engines in expedition vehicles that weigh over 7,000 pounds. And their average speed is 20 miles an hour. They crawl everywhere they go, so it works just fine.